国际辩论社第28集的播出。台湾即将在下周迎来总统大选，这场选战不仅关系着台湾人民，更是牵动着美中台三方未来的动向。哪一位候选人的获胜，代表着台湾将面临什么样的未来呢？我们稍后的观点好谈，请到专家做进一步的分析。美国观测站，我们来看到台湾大选将至了，近来频频传出有中国介入大选的迹象。那美国方面是有什么样的看法呢？我们要来请教美国之音白宫记者黄耀仪。
是的，白宫方面的确也是有来关注台湾本次大选是否有可能被干预的情况。那么我是在这个1月4号专访了白宫国安会的战略沟通协调官约翰科比。那么我就问他说呢，根据台湾政府的说法，还有一些国际媒体的报道，似乎有这样子的一个现象，就包括像是在网上来散布这个假讯息，或者呢是像台湾的检调单位现在根据反渗透法已经在调查几位受到中国招待的村里长来影响大选这样子的情况。那科比是告诉我说呢，他说他不针对这些个别的报道内容来做证实或评论，但是他说拜登政府的立场是不希望看到有任何人来干预台湾的大选。
We've been very clear that we respect Taiwan's democratic institutions. We respect the will of the people of Taiwan to make these sorts of decisions in terms of their own governance, and we don't want any other actor, be it a nation state or otherwise, to interfere in this election.
那么我就问科比说呢，如果到时候的确有确凿的证据证实了中国的确是来干预或影响了台湾大选，那么美国对于台湾的选举结果是否还是会有信心？科比呢也做出了回答。
Look, that's a hypothetical. I'm just not willing to speculate at this point. We want these elections to be free and fair and transparent. We want the will of the people of Taiwan to be respected, and we'll just monitor this as closely as we can.
那我们看到台湾的这个选战打得如火如荼之际呢，中国这边也没有闲着，一直派了有包括军机、海军舰艇等等来逼近台湾，甚至呢还有这个好几个高空气球飘过台湾，还飘过台湾的军事基地。那么科比是不愿意针对这个气球事件来发表看法，但是呢他说他要来向中国传达一个讯息，也就是让台湾民众安心投票很重要。What is White House message to China regarding rising the tension in the region before the Taiwan's election?
It's important that as the people of Taiwan go to the polls to cast their ballots, that they can do so with a feeling of safety and security and comfort in the knowledge that their vote matters and that it's going to be appropriately tallied. And that's really what we're focused on. That's what we want. What's what we want to see happen.
那科比也强调说呢，公民投票是一项庄严的权利，任何不管是国家或非国家的行为者呢，都不应该有任何理由来试图进行破坏。那么当然，除了这个美国的行政当局对台湾的选举是很关注之外呢，美国媒体也非常关注本次的台湾大选。例如说，像这个美国的全国广播公司 NPR 就有在节目当中呢，把台湾这次的大选呢列为2024年全球几个关键选举之一。
Let's on 观点好谈. For today's interview, we are honored to feature two distinguished scholars in the realm of Chinese politics. Joining us, let's welcome Lev Nachman, Assistant Professor at National Zhengzhi University, specializing in political science. Welcome, Lev.
Thank you for having me.
Also, let's welcome George Ng, contract researcher at the Center for China Studies at National Taiwan University. Welcome, George.
Oh, hello.
So I'm certain that their expertise will shed light on the complexities of the upcoming Chinese presidential election. So let's dive right into our first question with Lev. So what is your take on the upcoming presidential election, especially is it framed as a pro-China or pro-US, approach?
Yeah, so the thing that makes every Taiwanese election a little bit existential is because Taiwan is a contested state, meaning that the fundamental political question that we're always trying to understand here is what do Taiwanese people want for Taiwan's future and what is the relationship with China going to be? And every presidential election has had to wrestle with this question in some way. And of course, how we wrestle with that question has kind of varied over time. In 2016, this lens of China was framed through the Sunflower Movement. In 2020, it was largely through Hong Kong. And this time around, it's much more about these questions of war versus peace, democracy versus autocracy. And for better or for worse, that still is the question that I think both major political parties, the DPP and the KMT, are heavily leaning on when they're framing what this election is really about.
So do George agree on this?
So I have a slightly different take. I think this time all the major parties, they all agree on, to be honest, very similar foreign policy platform. So I think everyone believes that Taiwan's relationship with the U.S. is essential and very important. And also everyone believes that China poses at the very least some tough challenges for Taiwan. So I think we are seeing the emergence of a consensus in Taiwan among the major political parties that Taiwan needs to build a strong relationship with America and at the same time needs to really take the Chinese challenge very seriously.
I see. So like for the first question, there's different takes. What do you think of what George just said?
Yeah, I think, if there's one thing that all presidential candidates have agreed upon is that Taiwan needs to maintain the status quo and that no political party wants to see a change in the status quo. Of course, the difference is how they treat maintaining the status quo. Mm-hmm. For the DPP, it's been much more about diversifying away from the PRC. For the KMT, maintaining the status quo means building closer ties with the PRC.
Exactly.
And even though all three presidential candidates have all gone and made door knocks to the United States, they've all made it very clear that they value the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, we still do see some amount of variation within their camps about how they even approach the United States' relationship. For example, the KMT vice presidential candidate, Zhao Xiaokang, is, of course, no hiding when it comes to his sort of slight skepticism of the United States. And even though Hou Yu-ih himself has made many appeals saying that he is going to follow very closely in Tsai Ing-wen's approach to the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, we still see some amount of difference between these two camps and how they approach the United States.
Definitely. And both of you mentioned how this election might affect both the United States, Taiwan, and also China. So my next question will be going about the triangular relationships. Like how would this election result affect the three countries, basically?
So for Taiwan, of course, it's going to be a matter who's going to steer Taiwan, the ship for the next 4 years. It's meaningful because Taiwan's presidential past has always been 8 years, 8 years, 8 years. And if the DPP wins this election, it will be the first time we've actually seen this sort of lack of party turnover, which would be a very significant change for Taiwan either way. For the United States, the U.S.'s stance has been very clear that it supports any outcome that Taiwan has. The United States just wants to make sure that it's a free and fair democratic presidential election, and the United States is willing to work with any presidential candidate who happens to win. From the PRC's perspective, they of course prefer not the DPP. I think the PRC would be happy to see Ko Wen-je or Hou Yu-ih win with a preference for Hou Yu-ih. But from the PRC's perspective, if the DPP wins, then I think we're going to see a continuation of the very sort of icy relationship between the two sides of the strait.
Exactly. So George, like right after this election, do you think there will be like a major shift on the triangular relationships?
So there are a few things here, right? So first, this Taiwan-U.S. relationship. And I would say, yes, in Taiwan, everyone believes that the U.S. is a very important partner for Taiwan. But at the same time, we shouldn't forget that there is another presidential election coming up, which is the U.S. presidential election. So right now, so if there's going to be a Biden administration, I think there will be a lot of continuity. But if there's going to be a Trump administration, there will be a lot of uncertainty. So I think that's the first that's a challenge that all Taiwanese, presidential candidates would have to face if elected this year. So that's Taiwan-U.S. relationship. Into the U.S.-China relationship, that's also going to be a relationship that's very much, affected and maybe even to a certain extent determined by the next U.S. presidential election. So again, like Trump is a huge uncertainty. We don't really know, frankly, what kind of policy Trump would take when it comes to China. It could be very confrontational. A lot of people would bet that, but we don't know for sure, really, right? So there's that lack of the relationship U.S.-China. So in terms of the relationship between Taiwan, and China, so the tricky thing here is that this relationship will be very much determined by the competition between U.S. and China. So in a sense, so the uncertainty surrounding U.S.-China relations given the U.S. presidential election will also very much affect Taiwan-China relations.
Well, as you mentioned about the Biden administration, we know that President Biden actually mentioned warned about that the Chinese interference of this presidential election. So, Lev, do you see a sign of such interference?
Yeah, it's never a question of will the PRC try to influence Taiwan's domestic elections? It's a question of how will the PRC try to influence Taiwan's domestic elections? And we've already seen some very concrete examples. For example, the PRC has already started to strip away parts of ECFA, the economic trade deal that sort of manages relations between Taiwan and the PRC. with very new sort of carrot and stick approaches. But even the more direct one is the PRC's sort of threatened Terry Go's company to be put under investigation while he was a presidential candidate, which eventually led to him dropping out of the presidential race. I think that's sort of a very blatant example of the PRC trying to have some amount of influence over the Taiwan's election. Of course, there's lots of discourse about the more subtle ways in which the PRC tries to sway voters through misinformation campaigns or disinformation campaigns, and there's lots of different ways in which they try to do that. And then, of course, there's a lot more of this kind of pushing of this idea of 以美论, the idea of American skepticism being sort of a forefront of PRC disinformation this campaign cycle. So, we do see the PRC trying to have some effect on voters. The question, though, is does it actually work? In 2020, we saw sort of just thousands and thousands of Facebook videos, line groups, sort of really blatant attempts by the PRC to sort of sway Taiwanese voters to not even vote or to not have faith in democracy. And in 2020, we saw that voters still overwhelmingly voted for Tsai Ing-wen. And so what that tells us is that the PRC's attempts don't always have the effect that they want it to. Even though the PRC's approach has largely been throw everything at the wall and see what sticks when it comes to trying to influence Taiwanese voters, a lot of the time it doesn't actually necessarily have the intended effect the PRC would like.
Well, as you just mentioned about the 2020 election, I also like to reflect on the 2022 election, the local election, that we know that there's actually a very obvious, significant amount of anti-government sentiments happening that year. So do you think that the Chinese invasion, this card, actually isn't that working at all now in dominating, Taiwan's voters? Do you think that it's that crucial now?
Yeah, so I think if we look at 2020, we have to keep in mind that that's a local election and not a national election. And in Taiwan, these are two different logics, because local elections have largely been about punishing the party in power. At the very least, if you look at, say, the 2018 election, we saw a very similar response towards the DPP, where that was really the rise of Han Kuo-yu, and we saw the DPP do really spectacularly poorly in that local election. And in 2022, we also saw the DPP really get challenged with sort of their legitimacy as the ruling party. But as we've seen this election cycle, the DPP has actually managed to still come out very strong as a presidential candidate. Of course, it's been a very tough race for Lai Ching-te, but the DPP is not nearly as marginalized as it was in, say, the 2022 local elections. Now, I think that is largely because when it comes to national elections, this frame of China and Taiwan's relationship with the PRC is far more salient than it is in local elections. Local elections tend to be about a lot more local things than necessarily these questions of Taiwan's sovereignty or national security.
I see. Well, now globally, we also observe that there is a far-right political ideology happening now, especially in Europe and the U.S. So I'd like to know, George, do you observe that in Taiwan there's such a trend as well, the far-right political ideology?
So I think we need to first define what is far-right, ideology, right? So generally in the West, it's anti-immigration and also to a certain extent, you could say anti-international economic exchange, particularly trade, right? So from the perspective of Taiwan, so Taiwan does not face a serious immigration issue. Of course, although earlier there is this issue of, I think, 100,000 Indian immigrant workers come to Taiwan, right? But that's not, there are some discussions, concerning that, but that's not a big issue. So immigration is not a problem in Taiwan. And in terms of trade, so Taiwan, after all, is a small, nation that's quite dependent, on foreign trade, right? So, given Taiwan, the nature of Taiwan's economy, the Taiwanese population wouldn't be against free trade. In fact, if we look at the presidential election this time, every single presidential candidate, talks about the importance of promoting, Taiwan's integration, with the international economic and trade system, in terms of, either, further relationship with the U.S., or even CPTPP. So in that regard, there's really not a lot of, I think, political space for far-right ideology, in Taiwan.
But do you see it emerging in the future, possible?
I think very, very difficult. It's just that these two issues, immigration and anti-free trade protectionist sentiments, they're just not problems in Taiwan. It's not like in Europe, for instance. Right now in the Netherlands, we have an extreme right prime minister. Right, I just don't see that happening in Taiwan.
I see. What's your take, Lev?
I agree with George's second point about free trade, where Taiwan is so dependent on free trade that I don't think we're ever going to see an anti-free trade sentiment in Taiwan. But the issue of immigration, I have a slightly different opinion, where I do see a lot lot of potential for anti-immigration sentiment to grow in Taiwan for a couple of reasons. First, Taiwan has a demographic problem where our replacement rate of our population is not going to be high enough to replace the workers that we currently need. And to deal with that, Taiwan has largely been having more and more workers from Southeast Asia and South Asia come to Taiwan. And a lot of the rights and privileges that these people from South and Southeast Asia have is far more limited than, say, immigrants like me who are white Americans. And for now, it hasn't been a huge electoral issue because a lot of these people don't have voting rights. But in the future, when there's going to be more and more need for these Southeast and South Asian workers to play a prominent role in Taiwan's continuation as a society, I do think there is potential for a sort of contentious relationship between Taiwanese citizens and those who are coming from South and Southeast Asia. I know that there's annual labor rights marches and protests that South and Southeast Asian workers hold in Taiwan to fight for better rights and fight for better equality so that they're treated more equally because they have come to Taiwan to work and fill these gaps that the Taiwanese civil society really needs.
But as you just said, what you observed, do you think that the far right might emerge in Taiwan?
So I think, to George's point, I think it's important to distinguish far right from issues with immigration.
Exactly.
Where I don't think that those are always a neat overlap. What I do also think you do see some issues with far right is what we would call more conservative traditional values, sort of gender dynamics, sort of attitudes towards racial hierarchies. And even though those are by no means prominent in Taiwan in any way, you see wisps of them, but it has not grown in Taiwan in a way that, say, it's started to grow in, say, South Korea, where in South Korea you do see these questions of gender becoming very prominent in electoral politics. It hasn't happened in Taiwan, but because it's been able to manifest in South Korea, I don't think it's unreasonable to think that one day it could happen in Taiwan, but it has not started yet.
I see. Well, you mentioned about gender. I also like to mention about age. So, George, do you think that there's a generation gap between the voters now, the young and senior voters in Taiwan?
So there seems to be some discontent, I think, among the young voters. And as a result, specifically this discontent, I think, is reflected in the young voters' frustration, I think, with both the DPP and the KMT. So when we look at supporters of TPP, 民众党, like a key pillar of their support of TPP support is precisely among the young voters. And in this regard, I think the young voters I think there are definitely emergent issues of inequality, in Taiwan. So traditionally, class cleavage is not a major issue in Taiwanese politics. But I think by observing the past few elections, it's becoming more and more, of a problem. And in that sense, I think, in Taiwan, and I think Lev, would probably know better. But my sense is that the generational gap is actually also reflects a certain inequality, or class cleavage in Taiwan. Because generally, if you are older, you have capital, you have property, and you have established positions in society, while the young voters, they don't, they're probably still, getting paid 30,000, NTD a month, working very, very hard, but don't really see, much upward mobility.
Yeah, indeed. So how do you Lev see it? Like, what's the factor that differentiates the different political preference?
Yeah, so I think we also need to further disentangle old votes and young votes because there's far more variation within these camps than we even give credit for. This semester, I've actually been conducting focus groups with college students all around Taiwan at different universities, and I can already see that there's a difference between, say, Gen Z and millennial voters. Now, we would often group these two together and say they're all young voters, but really millennials who
Very
are,
different.
say, in their 30s are very different from 18-year-olds who are just sort of now becoming, full adults and developing a political consciousness. For example, a lot of 30, 35-year-olds have very clear memories of the Sunflower Movement and the CSSTA and all these protests, while 18-year-olds don't even know what that is, or have only heard bits and pieces about this. And this is a very fundamental political awakening event for a lot of millennial voters, which I do think has led to a lot of variation within these two groups between Gen Z and millennial. Let alone you have older generations. When we talk about the old vote, I think, again, you have to not only look at class, but also look at other pre-existing political ideologies, where I think older voters, if they're on the blue camp, will have different values and priorities than if you're an older voter on the green camp. But to George's point, I do think it's important to note that when we talk about these questions of wages and housing, things that young people really care about, old people don't necessarily care about wages and housing in that same way, which makes it really difficult, I think, for a lot of politicians and parties to really have and develop big, robust housing and wages policy platforms, because who votes the most in Taiwan? It's not young people. It's older people. And that's not a Taiwan problem. That's a democracy everywhere problem. It's really hard to mobilize young people. So if we really want to take the issue of wages and housing seriously, it's very difficult, because from a political perspective, there's not necessarily a direct incentive if your key voter base doesn't really care about wages and housing in that same way.
Indeed. So looking ahead, I want to ask both of you. So first, start with George. How do you perceive, like, for the presidential-elect, whoever this person is, to do with, like, internationally, to deliver a good gesture to the international society, and also domestically to unite what's happening now in Taiwan?
Right. I think most analysts would agree that the next president will probably face two minorities, 两个少数. So first is that it's quite likely that no one would get over 50%. Of course, we don't know for sure. There's still a possibility. And second is that we will see no majority in the legislative yuan, 立法院. And again, I'm not saying that that will necessarily be the case, but now the forecast, according to the numbers, seem to point that way. So in the context of these two minorities, 两个少数, the new president-elect would have to give, I think his victory speech on January 13th would be very, very important. So the first message that the president-elect would have to send is, a message of unification, but not unification with China, but unification, within
That's
Taiwan.
So hard.
Right? Yeah, to try to, it's going to be a minority, very likely a minority government. And if that's the case, how do we, unite the people of Taiwan? And second, I mean, even if it's over 50%, it's still a very tough, competitive election, right? So I think it would be quite important to remind, to send a signal to everyone that the election is now over. So now we should all work together, to further Taiwan's welfare and prosperity. So that's the first thing. And second thing is, I think the victory speech would also be very important in terms of a signal to also to Beijing, right? To try to establish some basically to reiterate, goodwill, right? That on the one hand, Taiwan, has, sovereignty, and it's important and essential to respect the result of Taiwan's, presidential election and the will of the people. But at the same time, to try to, also convey, that Taiwan is, really, has no intention of, challenging the status quo, and there are, vested interests, for all sides, to make sure that the Taiwan Strait and more generally the Indo-Pacific area, will be safe and prosperous, will be peaceful and prosperous. I think that's the important message to be sent.
So the balance will be very, very important.
Yeah.
So what's Lev's take on this?
Yeah, I agree. The challenge is going to be the real possibility of what we would call a hung parliament, where you have the party in power not having control over the parliament. So the possibility of the DPP being able to progress any meaningful policy agenda for the next 4 years will be incredibly constrained. Now, I do think there is possibility for policy to pass. If we look at, say, at one of Chen Shui-bian's eras, it was also a split parliament, and he was still able to pass some policy. I think things that everyone agrees upon, things like wages and housing. The silver lining to the wages and housing discourse in this presidential election is that everyone agrees that we need to work on wages and we need to address housing. So the hope is that even if it's a split government, that we can at least agree on these non-controversial issues. Where I do see the potential for a bit of a brick wall to be built is when it comes to issues of how do we address the PRC, how do we address the United States? How do we address things like national defense spending? These are much more difficult to pass or to even talk about if it's going to be a split government. And the ability to sort of unite Taiwan in the event of a split government will be an extremely tall order for Lai Ching-te to be able to accomplish if he wins. Now, of course, again, that's assuming that he wins, and of course, that's not a sure thing. And either way, if he does win this presidential election, if we look, say, to 2028, I know we're not even through 2024, but if we're already starting to look at the next presidential election, the idea of being able to win an incumbency, a re-election for Lai, if he has a really difficult 4 years, is just going to be even more difficult for the DPP. So, even though it's, not to put it too far in front of the picture, because we're not even through this presidential election cycle yet, but the results of this presidential election cycle, I think, will actually have serious implications for 2028, even before 2024 has ended.
Exactly. Well, the presidential election is right around the corner. It's happening next week. So we do hope that after the presidential election, we get to have both gentlemen back and we can discuss it about it yet again. So thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
感谢您加入今天的国际辩论社，我是刘晨曦，我们下周再会。